a missing envelope, a dead solicitor, and Miss Marple, already suspicious. Welcome to Enigma Abierto. I am your host, Alexander. I'd love to know where in the world are you tuning in from. You make this mystery worth telling. Let's dive in. The late June sun bathed the village of Little Wimbrel in a golden buttercup glow, casting long, lazy shadows across Gossington Green. It was a Saturday. One of those particularly English afternoons when the scent of cut grass mingled with lavender and lemon drizzle, and everything seemed set to proceed without incident. Mrs. Lavinia Blackwood's garden party had become something of an annual tradition in Little Wimbrel, second only to the harvest fete in social prestige. Guests arrived at precisely 3 o'clock, filtered in through the ivy-framed gate, and were met with flutes of elderflower cordial, cucumber sandwiches sliced thinner than the village patients, and the relentless cheerfulness of Mrs. Blackwood herself. "Darling, you must try the strawberry scones," Lavinia cooed, guiding her guests like a seasoned hostess navigating a battlefield of petty rivalries and faintly scandalous secrets. Cook used a new Devonshire cream, imported, among the throng clinking glasses, murmuring pleasantries, and exchanging polite gossips at Miss Jane Marple, nestled in a wicker chair near the rose trellis. She wore a pale blue cardigan and a sun hat trimmed with faded forgetments. Her knitting rested on her lap, untouched. Instead, her keen eyes flitted discreetly from guest to guest. Miss Marple had been invited, of course. Lavinia Blackwood never hosted a party without at least one respectable spinster present to lend an air of propriety. Besides, Miss Marple was universally considered harmless, a notion she had never felt the need to correct. The garden buzzed with conversation. Colonel Denning was expounding loudly on the failings of modern society to a bored vicar's wife. Young Sylvia Howard laughed heartily at the solicitor's son's jokes. And in the far corner, seated rather stiffly beneath the shade of the magnolia, sat Harold Crail, recently returned from somewhere abroad, and the subject of whispered speculation, back from India. "Wasn't he," murmured Mrs. Finch, the postmistress, to her sister behind her teacup, "or was it Burma? His mother died while he was away, you know, left him the whole estate. Awfully sudden, they say. Such a pale man," said her sister. "Looks like he hasn't seen daylight in years." At precisely 4:30, just as Mrs. Blackwood was preparing to unveil her walnut cake, a commotion stirred near the croquet lawn. Several heads turned. Then gasps cut through the genteel chatter like a blade through sponge cake. Young Timothy Quarles, red-faced and trembling, stood clutching a piece of parchment in one hand, his other pointing to a figure sprawled beneath the rose arbor. It was Mr. Bernard Pendleton, the retired banker. His necktie was askew, his mouth gaped in silent protest, and by the stillness of his limbs and the unnatural angle of his head, it was unmistakably clear he was dead. A high-pitched scream followed Miss Blackwood, predictably, and the guests surged as one toward the scene, suddenly united in horror and curiosity. Timothy dropped the parchment. It fluttered to the grass near Miss Marple's feet. She stooped and retrieved it with gloved fingers. It was an envelope, thick, cream paper, the kind used for formal correspondence. On the front, in elegant inked hand, was written "Envelope 3 to be opened only upon my death, Miss Marple." Expression unreadable, quietly slipped the envelope into her handbag. "Dear me," she murmured, mostly to herself. "How very curious, by 5:30. The garden party at Gossington Green had disintegrated into a scattered assembly of shocked villagers and hushed speculation. The neatly arranged tables, once laden with sandwiches and sponge cakes, now stood abandoned under the soft buzz of summer flies. Mrs. Lavinia Blackwood, her wide-brimmed hat askew and her voice high with anxiety, paced between her flower beds, like a hostess in a waking nightmare. "I simply cannot understand it," she said for the 4th time to no one in particular. One moment he was chuckling over my lemon tart, and the next, well, dead beneath the roses, Bernard Pendleton, and at my party, of all places, how ghastly, the local constable. Young and stiff-backed Constable Rowntree had arrived promptly at 5, summoned by a frantic housemaid sent running through the village. He now stood near the body, a small notebook clutched awkwardly in one hand, a pencil in the other, his chin, sparsely dotted with the beginnings of a beard. Trembled with the enormity of his assignment, I'd rather no one moved about too much. He said, though no one was listening, "It's a crime scene now, we must wait for the inspector from the county." From her seat near the rose trellis, Miss Marple observed all this with the same calm, half-knitted composure she had shown an hour before. Her hands had returned to their needles, the rhythmic click of them oddly soothing amid the unease. Beside her stood Reverend Collingswood, tall and lean, his collar tight beneath a long neck that reminded some villagers of a heron. He looked grave, as befitted a clergyman in the presence of death, though there was something in his eyes, an old sadness, perhaps, that deepened as he gazed toward the croquet lawn. "I baptized Bernard Pendleton's daughter," he said softly, mostly to himself. "That was some 27 years ago. She died in a boating accident before her 16th birthday." Miss Marple looked up gently, a tragic thing, drowning, so silent. So final, yes, the Reverend agreed, and he never quite recovered, poor fellow. Kept to himself, travelled now and then, though I did hear he was working on something rather private, papers, wills, or some such. Miss Marple nodded but said nothing. Her mind was already considering the envelope. Behind them, gossip bloomed. Like hyacinths in spring, I heard he had a falling out with Harold Crail, murmuring Mrs. Finch to her sister, shielding her words behind a napkin, over an inheritance or a boundary wall, or both. Heard the same, the sister replied, eyes gleaming. Harold's been awfully cagey since he came back from wherever it was, always looking over his shoulder, like someone's chasing him. Across the lawn, Sylvia Howard clutched the arm of Nigel Thresby, the solicitor's son, her fingers pale, against his tweed sleeve. "I was just speaking to him," she whispered. "Only minutes before. He complimented my hair, said it reminded him of someone from his youth. Isn't that odd, Nigel, who had never quite known how to speak to girls without legal terms, simply nodded. Harold Crail, meanwhile, stood aloof beneath the magnolia, arms folded tightly across his chest. His face was unreadably pale, angular, lined with the kind of weariness that doesn't come from age alone. He watched the flurry of concern with the cool distance of someone used to detachment. Only once did he glance toward Miss Marple, and when he did, it was brief, as the sun began to sink behind the hedgerows, painting the sky in soft apricot hues. Inspector Alec Brantham arrived from the county station. A burly man in his late 40s with a keen eye and a strong jaw. Brantham had the air of someone who took little on trust and even less from amateur detectives. He knelt beside the body, conferred in low tones with Constable Rowntree, then stood and surveyed the remaining guests with the practiced firmness of a man who'd questioned more than his share of Sunday drinkers and back-alley rowdies. He addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for your patience. I understand this has been a dreadful shock, and I assure you we'll get to the bottom of it. Mr. Pendleton's death is being treated as suspicious until we can rule otherwise." A few gasps met his declaration. "I'll need a brief statement from each of you before you leave the premises," Brantham continued. "Nothing to detail, just where you were and what you saw after 4 o'clock. Miss Marple rose quietly from her chair and approached the inspector with her usual air of sweet-tempered curiosity. "I wonder, Inspector," she said in her soft, fluttery voice, "if it might be helpful to know that the deceased was holding an envelope marked Envelope 3 to be opened only upon my death." Rather prophetic, wouldn't you say, Brantham? frowned. "And where is this envelope now?" "In my handbag," Miss Marple replied without flinching. The inspector blinked, then cleared his throat. "You removed evidence from the scene." "Only to preserve it," she said with an apologetic smile. "You see, the wind had picked up, and it seemed such a shame for it to blow away. I do hope I haven't committed a grave procedural sin." Brantham sighed. "May I?" She handed it over. He examined the envelope without opening it, turning it over as if it might whisper secrets. Strange. Numbered, no less. Wonder if there are more. Miss Marple tilted her head. "It does make one think." "Doesn't it?" Brantham looked at her for a long moment, then back to the envelope. "We'll hold onto this for now. Thank you, Miss Marple. I trust you won't mind staying in the village for the time being." "Oh, I never stray far," she said pleasantly. "I find everything of interest happens within a mile of the vicarage." By twilight, the crowd had thinned, statements were taken, the body was removed, and the garden party that had begun with lemon cakes and laughter ended with solemn faces and whispered doubts. Inside Gossington Hall, Lavinia Blackwood sat in her drawing-room, trembling hands clasped around a cold cup of tea. Her husband, dreaded naval man Captain Henry Blackwood, stood beside the fireplace, his expression unreadable. "It's terrible," Lavinia murmured. "Absolutely ghastly. A murder at our garden party." Captain Blackwood's voice was measured. "We don't know that it was murder, my dear." She looked up, eyes rimmed with tears. "He choked, didn't he? You saw his face was so blue. He could have had a seizure, a heart attack. We shouldn't jump to conclusions, but the envelope," she said, gripping his sleeve. "Henry. It said to open it upon his death. What if he knew something? What if someone wanted whatever it was badly enough to?" She trailed off. The room grew still. Miss Marple, back at her own cottage, had just lit the kettle. The news would be all over Little Wimbrel by morning, but even as the first stars emerged in the dusky sky, her mind was already weaving threads of thought, each one tied not to evidence, but to people, to behavior, to what people said and what they didn't. She sat down with her tea and a fresh skein of yarn, her needles clinking softly in the lamplight. Somewhere in the village, she suspected, lay the answer to Mr. Pendleton's final envelope, and Miss Marple, as ever, intended to find it. By the following morning, Little Wimbrel was ablaze with speculation. The death of Bernard Pendleton had already taken on a dozen different versions, each more dramatic than the last, and none hindered by facts. The post office was abuzz. The greengrocer's shop saw more foot traffic than produce sales, at least. 3 people claimed to have seen Mr. Pendleton clutched his chest just before collapsing, while 2 others insisted they had heard a cry through precisely what was said, or who said it. Remained as elusive as the June mist. Miss Marple, dressed in her usual lavender blouse and light cardigan, walked quietly through the village on her way to the church. It was not Sunday, but a midweek morning service was scheduled for the faithful or the curious. She had, over the years, learned that people said things in pews and parlours that they would never reveal to an officer of the law as she passed the bakery. Young Timothy Quarles burst out through the door, nearly colliding with her. "Oh, Miss Marple, sorry, terribly sorry. No harm done, Timothy," she said kindly, brushing invisible crumbs from her sleeve. "Are you quite well this morning? Yesterday must have given you a fright." He shifted from foot to foot, his freckled face flushed. "It did, yes. Well, I've never seen anything like that before." Mr. Pendleton just crumpled like a marionette with its strings cut. Miss Marple's expression softened. "It's never easy, seeing death for the first time. But I wonder, dear, what were you doing near the rose arbor?" He blinked. "Oh, just going for a sandwich. I think I'd left my plate on the bench, or perhaps I was looking for Sylvia." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, Sylvia Howard." Timothy went bright red. only because she'd said she might be near the roses. It wasn't its note mean. I didn't see anything, really. I'm sure you saw exactly what you were meant to see, she replied gently, and let the matter rest. The churchyard was still when Miss Marple arrived, inside. Reverend Collingswood was lighting candles for the short service. Only a scattering of parishioners had gathered, all older women except for Sylvia Howard, who sat alone in the third pew, looking unusually subdued, after the final hymn. The vicar offered a general prayer for the departed soul of Bernard Pendleton, adding a line about justice and truth, prevailing a subtle nod, perhaps, to the mystery now engulfing the village. As the congregation drifted out, Miss Marple remained behind. Reverend Collingswood approached, his expression weary. "Miss Marple, I imagine you'll be doing your own sort of quiet inquiry." She smiled modestly. "I always think one hears so much more when one listens gently, don't you?" He nodded, then lowered his voice. "I had a letter from Bernard 2 days ago that made her pause. Did you now? Nothing dramatic," he continued. "Just a request to meet. He wrote that he had something of a moral dilemma, something from the past. He didn't elaborate. We were meant to meet next week." "I see. And did he mention anything about envelopes?" The vicar raised an eyebrow. "Envelopes? There was one found on his person," she said delicately, "marked envelope 3. Rather theatrical, I must admit. No, he said nothing of the sort. But now I rather wish I had insisted he meet me sooner." Outside, a group of villagers stood in tight clusters, discussing the death with wide eyes and dramatic gestures. Mrs. Finch was holding court near the light gate, her shawl wrapped tight as though shielding herself from scandal rather than wind. "They say it might have been poison," she whispered loudly. "Something slipped into his cordial, or maybe a cake. I warned Lavinia not to let that Crail fellow handle the food. Foreign travels can make a man strange," her sister added, "and there was that quarrel, don't forget, with the boundary hedge, asked another. "Oh yes, last spring. Bernard claimed Harold had planted shrubs a good 6 inches into his garden. It went on for months. Letters, lawyer's-nasty business. Meanwhile, Harold Crail had taken refuge in the Black Swan Inn, occupying a solitary table by the window. A pint of ale sat untouched in front of him as he stared out at the cobbled lane beyond. When Inspector Brantham entered not long after, Harold straightened, but did not rise. Brantham pulled out the opposite chair and sat down heavily. "Mr. Crail, mind if I join you? Free Village, Inspector." Brantham ignored the remark. "You are close to Mr. Pendleton, I understand. I rented a cottage from him," Harold replied. "That's all. He wasn't a man you could be close to. He kept his distance, suspicious of everyone." "Did you argue with him recently?" "Everyone in this village has argued with someone recently," Harold said, his voice dry. "Especially Bernard. He thrived on grievance, garden hedges, dog noise, misplaced parcels. He had a whole notebook of offences." Brantham opened his own notebook. "Can you account for your movements yesterday afternoon?" Harold's gaze didn't waver. "I arrived at the party just before 4. I stayed by the Magnolia. I didn't speak to him. I left as soon as the commotion started. You didn't approach him, or see anyone who did. I saw Timothy running about, and Sylvia, she was flitting around like a butterfly. Pendleton had a soft spot for her, I think, saw something of his daughter in her." Brantham made a note. "Did you see the envelope?" "No," Harold said, eyes narrowing. "What envelope?" "Never mind for now." The inspector closed the book and stood. "Stay available, Mr. Crail, and don't go pruning any hedges." That afternoon, Inspector Brantham called at Miss Marple's cottage, hat in hand. She welcomed him inside with her usual grace, setting down her knitting and offering a slice of seed cake. "I won't stay long," he said, declining the cake. But I'd like your thoughts. Off the record. Miss Marple smiled, pouring tea. Of course, dear, though I suspect your record is the one that matters. Brantham leaned forward. Do you think it was murder? She stirred her tea. I think Bernard Pendleton was not a popular man. He had money, property, and a sharp tongue. But most importantly, he had secrets. People tend to grow careful when their secrets are threatened. He nodded. And the envelope. I suspect there are more, she said. 3 suggests a series. And I don't believe it's a coincidence he died on the very day envelope 3 was meant to be opened. It may not contain a will or confession, but perhaps a revelation. Something damaging. Brantham stood slowly. If someone killed him to prevent that envelope from being read, then they were too late, Miss Marple said, her voice soft, because whatever it was, it had already been set in motion as he left. The inspector glanced back at her tidy front garden. The roses just beginning to open beneath the early summer sun. Little Wimbrel had lost its innocence in a single afternoon. Now, as secrets rustled behind drawn curtains and whispered over teacups, Miss Marple knew the truth lay not in forensics or fingerprints, but in the delicate dance of motives, missteps, and misdirection, and someone, somewhere, was about to make their next move. The following day dawned misty and cool, as if the weather itself was uncertain how to proceed in the wake of Bernard Pendleton's sudden death. A light drizzle fell over the thatched rooftops and ivy-draped cottages of Little Wimbrel, damping the village's summer cheer but not its curiosity. The villagers were subdued in movement, yet active in speculation. Gossip, it seemed, could not be silenced by weather. At the police station, little more than 2 rooms tucked behind the town hall, Inspector Brantham reviewed the interviews taken at Gossington Green. He had arranged the statements into piles, those who had seen something, and those who claimed they had not. Most, predictably, belonged to the latter. Only a few offered remarks that piqued his interest. Timothy Quall's nervous testimony, for example, had been inconsistent. First, he claimed he was retrieving a sandwich. Later, he'd admitted to looking for Sylvia Howard. In Brantham's experience, lies were usually born from shame, not guilt. Still, the boy had been closest to the scene. Then there was Sylvia herself, vivacious and pretty, with an innocent air that didn't quite mask a calculating mind. Sylvia had downplayed her presence near the rose arbor. She'd insisted she had been admiring the flowers from a distance, but her name had appeared several times in others' accounts, often too close to the deceased for coincidence. And finally, Harold Crail. His tone was defensive, his history murky. There had been no proof of enmity with Pendleton beyond vague references to a garden dispute. Yet Brantham felt something guarded in the man's manner, an evasiveness not born of grief, but of weariness, as if Harold had spent too many years concealing something. It was Harold who first drew the inspector's attention as a viable suspect. By late morning, Brantham paid him a second visit. This time, he brought Constable Rowntree along, perhaps for effect, perhaps for record. The cottage Harold rented from the late Mr. Pendleton was a modest two-storey affair on the edge of the village, its gravel path flanked by overgrown shrubs and a crack sundial. Harold answered the door in a linen shirt, sleeves rolled, pipe unlit in hand. You again, he said. You must enjoy the view. May we come in? Brantham asked. Harold stepped aside. Be my guest, though I doubt the wallpaper will offer much insight. Inside, the sitting room was sparse, a few worn armchairs, a bookshelf lined with travelogues, a faded rug. Everything about it spoke of transience, a man not planning to stay. Brantham wasted no time. Mr. Crail, we've spoken to several villagers who mentioned tension between you and Mr. Pendleton. I'd like to know more. Harold sat on the arm of one chair, arms crossed. He was my landlord, a pedantic one, wrote Notes about beans being left ajar, threatened legal action over a bird feeder, said the seed might attract rats, any financial disputes, he raised the rent last month. I refused to pay until he fixed the boiler, that was the last of it. Brantham glanced at Rowntree, who scribbled, "Where were you at exactly 4:30 yesterday afternoon? I was standing under the magnolia tree, alone, watching the croquet match." "Several people saw me there. I didn't move. You didn't speak." To Mr. Pendleton, "No. Did you see anyone else approach him?" Harold hesitated. "Sylvia, she walked by him at one point. I think he said something to her. She smiled, then moved on. And the boy, Quarles, he was fluttering about like a moth. Would you describe your relationship with Miss Howard as close?" Harold's eyes narrowed. "Is that your next suspect, then?" "We're simply building a picture," Brantham said calmly. Harold exhaled, then rose and walked to the window. The drizzle had become a fine mist. "Sylvia is young, eager. People underestimate her. But she knows exactly how people see her. She uses it, so you weren't involved. I wasn't foolish enough to be," Harold said curtly. Brantham stood. "Thank you for your time." When they had gone, Harold remained at the window, pipe still unlit, the mist beading on the glass like sweat. Later that day, Sylvia Howard received a very different sort of visit. She was at home with her aunt, Miss Dora Howard, a stern woman with a crooked spine and a talent for perceiving sin in every cup of tea. Their sitting room was cramped with crocheted cushions, porcelain cats, and the faint smell of lavender polish. Sylvia, curled on the settee with a magazine, looked up with a start when Miss Marple was shown in. "Miss Marple," she exclaimed, "come in, please. It's ever so dreary today." Miss Marple stepped inside, removing her gloves. "Yes, quite damp. My roses hate this sort of weather." But the lilacs seemed to thrive. Sylvia smiled. "You've come about Mr. Pendleton, haven't you?" "People keep asking, don't they? And naturally. I imagine you've had quite your share." Sylvia folded her hands primly. "It's awful. I hardly knew him. He sometimes said strange compliments, really, about my hair, my voice. I think I reminded him of someone, his daughter, perhaps, Miss Marple said gently. "Yes, that's what I thought." Sylvia's eyes flickered. "I never encouraged him, of course not, dear. But I do wonder, did he ever give you anything? Give me a letter, perhaps, or a note?" Sylvia hesitated. "No, why?" Miss Marple gave a delicate shrug. "Just a curious thought. He was a man who seemed fond of leaving things behind in envelopes." Sylvia looked away. "No, nothing like that." Miss Marple nodded, changing the subject. "Did you happen to see anyone with Mr. Pendleton before the incident? I passed him on the way to the buffet," Sylvia said slowly. "He looked at me, smiled, that's all, then I walked away." "Nothing else?" "No." "I see, and you don't recall seeing him speak to Harold Crail?" Sylvia gave a quick, almost imperceptible glance toward her aunt. "I don't believe so." Miss Marple thanked her, made polite conversation for a few minutes, then rose to leave. As she stepped outside, her mind ticked quietly. The girl was hiding something. Perhaps not guilt, but certainly knowledge. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, a blanket on her lap and her notebook open. She didn't often write things down, but when motives grew muddied, a diagram helped. She drew 3 names: Harold Crail, Sylvia Howard, Timothy Quarles. She circled each one. Then, a box beside them, Bernard Pendleton. Beneath it, a smaller box, envelope 3, another box, drawn with more hesitation, envelope 1. The mystery of the envelopes remained unresolved, and Miss Marple knew, in her bones, that their contents, whatever they were, held the key. But the deeper truth was this: the murder wasn't just about one man's death, it was about what he knew, what he was about to reveal, and someone had silenced him before that truth could come to light. The morning after Miss Marple's visit to Sylvia Howard, the mist lifted over Little Wimbrel, unveiling a village that remained quiet in body, but increasingly noisy in spirit. Beneath the polite smiles and curt nods, attention now hummed-like. A low drone underfoot, people shut their doors with more care, they lingered in their gardens longer, ears tilted subtly toward neighbouring fences. Bernard Pendleton's funeral had been scheduled for the following Tuesday. In the meantime, Inspector Brantham continued his methodical investigation, and the contents of the mysterious envelope remained sealed and under lock. Only he and the chief superintendent in nearby Melbury knew where it was now kept, yet even Brantham, with all his procedural rigour, could not locate the other two envelopes hinted at by the first. Envelope 3 suggested the existence of at least two predecessors, possibly more an ominous breadcrumb trail that had, for now, vanished into the hedgerows of memory. Meanwhile, Miss Marple, who was not one to meddle but had a rather expansive view of what constituted helpfulness, received a visit of her own. It was Mrs. Lavinia Blackwood. Looking considerably less formidable than usual, she arrived at Miss Marple's cottage just past 10 o'clock. Wrapped in a dove-green shawl and bearing a box of sugared almonds, my dear Jane, she began after being seated and coaxed into accepting a cup of tea. I do hope I'm not intruding. I know how you value your mornings. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Not at all, Lavinia. It's lovely to see you. Though I dare say it's not the almonds that bring you. Lavinia sighed and leaned in slightly. You're quite right. Of course, I'm dreadfully worried. About the party, about what people are saying. They'll talk, said Miss Marple mildly. It's what villagers do best. I know, Lavinia said, brushing a hand along her skirt. But it's the envelope, you see. That third envelope. I cannot stop thinking about it. What if it contained something about one of us, about something that happened long ago? Miss Marple tilted her head. Do you suspect it might? Lavinia hesitated. Oh, I wouldn't say that exactly. But Bernard was a collector of grievances, wasn't he? Always scribbling in his little notebook, writing letters to the parish council, to the post office, even to the bishop. Did you know that I had heard? Miss Marple said delicately. Well, Lavinia continued, I've remembered something odd. It may be nothing, but I thought, perhaps, you'd know if it was significant. Miss Marple set down her cup. Go on. It was 2 days before the party. I was in the front garden, pruning the hydrangeas, and I saw Bernard walking toward the village centre. He was holding a quite thick brown envelope. I only noticed because it slipped from under his arm and fell. I called out, and he picked it up, seemed flustered, thanked me, and walked off in a great hurry. But as he bent, I caught a glimpse of the front. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Yes, it said envelope 1, very clearly, in that same strong, slanted hand. Now Miss Marple sat up straighter. Are you quite certain? Entirely. And he did not mention it, offer any explanation? None. Just thanked me and went on. I thought perhaps he'd taken to cataloguing his estate. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. That's very helpful, Lavinia. Thank you. After the lady had gone, Miss Marple returned to her armchair, thoughtful. A timeline had begun to form. Bernard Pendleton had been carrying envelope 1 2 days before the garden party. Envelope 3 had been found upon his body. But what of envelope 2? More pressing still, what was an envelope 1, and where had it gone? That afternoon, she paid a visit to the local solicitor, Mr. Edward Griggs, whose narrow office overlooked the village square. He was a lean, fidgety man in spectacles, given more to bookkeeping than high-stakes intrigue, but his name had come up more than once in association with Bernard Pendleton. After the usual pleasantries, Miss Marple got to the point. I wonder, Mr. Griggs, she asked, if Bernard Pendleton deposited any documents with you recently, something in the last week, perhaps. Griggs looked surprised, then wary. You mean of a legal nature? Not necessarily. Something personal, perhaps, in an envelope. He adjusted his glasses. Well, yes, actually, he did. How odd that you should know. Miss Marple smiled. Call it intuition. Was it marked in any way? Griggs nodded slowly. It was labelled envelope 1. He asked me to hold it until after the garden party. Said he might give me further instruction following the event, but if anything happened to him before then, I was to surrender it to the police. Miss Marple's voice was very quiet. And have you? Not yet. I wasn't certain what was prudent. The police haven't inquired about it, and I didn't want to cause unnecessary confusion. She gave him a long, thoughtful look. Would you allow me to read it? Just for a moment. Griggs hesitated. I'm not sure you may, of course, accompany me while I do, eventually. He relented, producing the envelope from a locked drawer and handing it over with ceremonial caution. Miss Marple opened it slowly, her fingers delicate with the paper. Inside was a single sheet of cream stationery. The handwriting was indeed Bernard Pendleton's, unmistakable. To whom it may concern, if you are reading this, I have either perished by unnatural means or have chosen to expose a truth long buried. I possess knowledge of a betrayal that occurred many years ago, one that resulted in a young woman's ruin and a man's escape from justice. The matter concerns the Crail family, the Howard family. And myself, I have held this knowledge in silence for decades, but recently circumstances and letters and threats have compelled me to act. This is not a confession, but a warning. There are more letters, more envelopes. And someone, I believe, would kill to keep them unopened. Bernard J. Pendleton. Miss Marple read the letter twice. Then she folded it neatly, returned it to the envelope, and handed it back to Griggs. Thank you, she said simply. As she walked home, her steps were slow, deliberate. Her thoughts were not so much on what was written, but on what had been left unsaid, the betrayal, the families. The warning, it all pointed to something that had festered beneath the surface of Little Wimbrel for years, and in a village where time moved slowly and people never truly forgot. It seemed the past had finally demanded its due. That night, Miss Marple sat long after her candle had guttered, her hands still, her knitting basket untouched. She knew now that the real mystery was older than Bernard's death, and the truth, when it came, would be anything but polite. The following day, a rare patch of sun spread over Little Wimbrel, gilding its narrow lanes and blooming hedgerows in soft light. But the brightness did little to lift the mood. A peculiar hush had descended on the village, as though every cottage, shop, and soul were holding its breath. The atmosphere had shifted from gossip to caution. People spoke in lowered tones and glanced over their shoulders. For the first time in living memory, villagers were locking their doors during daylight hours. Miss Marple, who had always believed that human nature was best observed through a mixture of gentle inquiry and timely silence, had come to a quiet conclusion that there were more than enough secrets in Little Wimbrel to account for a dozen murders, but she wasn't interested in quantity. She was looking for one particular secret that Bernard Pendleton had tried, with some effort and foresight, to reveal before his life was cut short. She began her morning as usual with a modest breakfast and a short walk to the post office. Not for the mail, though she did enjoy receiving letters, but for the pulse of the village. Mrs. Finch, ever a fountain of unsolicited opinion, was already behind the counter, arranging parcels. "Well, if it isn't Miss Marple," she said with mock surprise. "You'll have heard, I expect." "Heard what, dear?" Mrs. Finch leaned forward, eyes sharp. "Inspector Brantham went to see the Howards this morning. Took another officer with him. Word is he's asking about some old business with Sylvia's father. Something about the church accounts. Years ago, before the man died, embezzlement, they say, quietly handled. Of course, how very interesting," Miss Marple said mildly. I do hope it's not upsetting Miss Sylvia. Mrs. Finch sniffed. That one doesn't upset easily. Far too clever for her own good. Pretty little thing, though. Always reminded me of her mother's smile. Only the mother was kinder. With that, Miss Marple thanked her and made her way to the vicarage. Reverend Collingwood answered the door himself. He looked older than usual, as though the last few days had aged him several years. Miss Marple, he said with a weary smile. Do come in. She entered the familiar drawing-room, sparsely furnished but tidy, with the faint scent of pipe tobacco and camphor. You look tired, dear, she said gently. I am tired, he admitted, sinking into his chair. Tired of half-truths and the weight of things best forgotten. Miss Marple folded her hands. Sometimes I find the past insists on being remembered. He was silent for a time, then sighed. I knew about the envelope, not what it contained, only that Bernard had written it. He came to me for advice. You see, he was afraid. Afraid of whom? Not of a single person, Collingwood replied, but of what might come out. The story is tangled. Old sins and new reputations. I advised caution. He wanted justice. I didn't realize how determined he was to set things right. What sort of justice was he after? The Reverend hesitated, then said, Do you recall Eleanor Howard, Sylvia's mother? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, a quiet woman, beautiful, died young. Didn't she, tragically? Yes, but not without cause. He rose and walked to the window. There was a scandal, he said softly, long buried. Eleanor was accused of forging church cheques. The funds were small, but the disgrace was immense. Her husband, who had connections in the diocese, smoothed things over outwardly, but he believed she had done it. He cast her out, emotionally if not physically. She never recovered from the shame. Died not long after. Pneumonia, they said. But I always believed it was heartbreak. Miss Marple was very still, and Bernard Pendleton, he was the treasurer at the time, quiet, diligent, but not blameless. He confessed to me, years later, that he had reason to believe Eleanor was innocent, that someone else, another committee member, had forged the documents and let her take the blame. Did he know who? Yes, the Reverend said, turning, but he would not say the name. Said he had no proof then, only suspicion. But in the last month or so, he told me he had found letters, and something more like a signed receipt, perhaps. He was planning to expose the truth, to clear her name, and he died before he could. The Reverend nodded. Miss Marple's thoughts flicked back to Sylvia, the daughter of a woman ruined by whispers, raised by an aunt with a spine of iron and a heart of stone. Sylvia's need to appear innocent, to be perceived as angelicity, wasn't vanity, it was survival. After leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple walked slowly through the village green, where she encountered Timothy Quarles, who was sitting alone on a bench, his hands in his lap. Good morning, Timothy, she said, pausing. Miss Marple, he replied, his tone subdued. You look a little troubled. He glanced at her, then down. I suppose I am. You were close to Sylvia, weren't you? A pause, then I thought I was, but she's different, somehow, not what I thought. Miss Marple sat beside him. The world teaches us things, sometimes faster than we're ready to learn them. I didn't tell the inspector everything, he said suddenly. I saw something. That day, at the party, she waited, not pressing. I saw Sylvia walk away from Mr. Pendleton. And I think she dropped something, or maybe he gave it to her. I didn't see clearly, but there was something in her hand, an envelope. Miss Marple's heart gave a soft flutter. And where did she go after that? She walked past the tool shed, then into the house. Did you mention this to anyone? No, I wasn't sure. I didn't want to get her in trouble. Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on him. It's never wrong to tell the truth, Timothy, even if it hurts. That evening, with twilight creeping through the village like a silent tide, Miss Marple visited Inspector Brantham at the station. She relayed what she had learned about the history of Eleanor Howard, the shadow over her name, and the revelation that Sylvia may have received or hidden another envelope. Brantham sat back, arms crossed. You think Sylvia's trying to keep her mother's name buried, even if it means silencing the man who tried to exonerate her. I don't know, Miss Marple said. But I suspect Sylvia is protecting something or someone, and if envelope 2 is still out there, it may hold the final piece. Brantham exhaled. If she has it, we'll find it. But Miss Marple wasn't so certain. Sylvia, she suspected, would not yield to pressure. She would need something quiet, clever, a little psychological unravelling, and as Miss Marple returned to her cottage, the first stars glimmering overhead, she began to prepare for just that. The past had returned to Little Wimbrel, sharp-edged and uninvited. Now it was time to see who could withstand its touch and who would break beneath it. It was the kind of still, cloudless evening that Little Wimbrel rarely enjoyed, with the sky painted in hues of mauve and gold and the air carrying the sweet tang of honeysuckle. Yet despite the beauty outside, the village felt unsettled, like a painting slightly askew. It wasn't just the tragedy of Bernard Pendleton's death or the murky implications of the envelopes, it was the sense that something else was about to happen. Something no one could name, but everyone could feel. Miss Marple rose earlier than usual the next morning. Her dreams had been unusually vivid flashes of ink on cream paper, Sylvia Howard in shadow, and an image of a rose bush shedding petals like falling tears. She brushed the thoughts aside as fancy. Though she had long trusted her subconscious more than most people trusted facts. By 8 o'clock, she was already dressed and out for a walk, choosing the long route that looped past the church, the old mill path, and the back lane that ran behind Harold Crale's rented cottage. She never hurried, not outwardly. But she timed her arrival with quiet precision. The back gate to the cottage was ajar. That in itself wasn't shocking. Harold was a man of loose habits and little ceremony. What caught Miss Marple's attention was the silence, a different sort of silence than the morning calm. This was the absence of life, no bird song, no rustling. Not even the usual creak of the weathered gate in the breeze. She stepped closer. There was no sign of movement inside the cottage. The curtains were drawn unevenly, a cup sat on the windowsill, untouched. A faint metallic smell drifted from the back steps. It was only then that she saw the trail. Small dots, dark, drying, blood. Miss Marple stood very still for several seconds, then reached for the latch and pushed the door open. The scene that greeted her was grim and disordered. A chair knocked over, a cushion on the floor, a drawer partially open, and near the hearth, crumpled on the carpet, lay Harold Crale. He was quite still, pale. A deep gash across his temple, a smear of blood, on the nearby table. But he was breathing, barely. Miss Marple didn't scream, she didn't flail. She walked swiftly to the hallway, picked up the telephone, and rang the police station. By the time Inspector Brantham arrived, Harold had been taken to Melbury Hospital in a dazed, semi-conscious state. The doctor on call suspected blunt force trauma, likely inflicted with something heavy, a vase, a candlestick, possibly the poker, which had been found knocked over near the fireplace. Brantham crouched in the middle of the sitting room, his face set in grim determination. "This changes things," he muttered, more to himself than to Miss Marple. If someone tried to kill Crale, they may have done it to silence him. Perhaps he knew too much, or perhaps he had something. Miss Marple added softly. Brantham looked up. "You think this is about the second envelope?" "I do." "I think he may have hidden it somewhere safe, and someone found out." The inspector stood, scanning the room. "There's no sign of forced entry. Whoever did this, he or she was let in, or already inside." Miss Marple nodded, which means Harold knew his attacker. A brief silence stretched between them, then Brantham sighed. I'll need to question Sylvia Howard again. She won't be easy to corner, Miss Marple said, but I believe it's time I spoke with her myself. Brantham raised an eyebrow. You think she'll confide in you? I think she may not even realize what she's given away already. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the Howard home once more. Sylvia greeted her at the door, visibly pale and distracted. Her aunt, Miss Dora, hovered like a suspicious crow in the background, but excused herself after a few strained words. Sylvia led Miss Marple to the drawing-room, where the sunlight fell in slanted bars across a rose-patterned rug. Sylvia sat on the edge of the settee, twisting a handkerchief between her fingers. "You've heard, haven't you," she said before Miss Marple could speak, "about Harold?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, a dreadful thing." Sylvia looked away. "Do they think he'll die? The doctors say he has a strong chance, but it depends on how soon he regains consciousness." A silence fell. Sylvia's voice was small. "They'll blame me, should they?" Her head jerked up, eyes wide. "I don't mean did you hurt him," Miss Marple said gently. "I mean, are you afraid of what he might say when he wakes?" Sylvia swallowed. "I never said anything, not really, but he hinted that he knew something about my mother, something important." Miss Marple sat back, her voice light as lace. "You took something from Mr. Pendleton that day, didn't you? An envelope?" Sylvia closed her eyes. "I didn't know what it was," she said eventually. "He told me to hold onto it. Said I could decide whether to read it, that it was for me, but when Harold saw me put it in my bag, he started asking questions. He said it was a trap that Pendleton was trying to drag up old ghosts and ruin us all." Miss Marple waited. "I panicked," Sylvia whispered. "I hid the envelope in the drawer of an old music box in the attic. Then I tried to forget it, but Harold kept asking, pressuring me. He said if I gave it to him, he'd take care of it. And did you?" "No, but last night the music box was gone. Someone broke the lock." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Sylvia, did you tell anyone else where you hid it?" "No, only Harold. I thought he'd keep it a secret." Miss Marple stood. "It seems someone else found out, and they were willing to kill to keep it hidden." Sylvia's voice cracked. "Was it about my mother? What could be so terrible that someone would?" Miss Marple looked at her gently. "I don't know, but I believe your mother was innocent, and someone went to great lengths to ensure she remained disgraced. That same someone is still here in Little Wimbrel, watching, waiting. And I believe they've slipped once already." As Miss Marple took her leave, she saw the figure of Miss Dora Howard standing silently at the top of the stairs, half shrouded in shadow. That night, word spread that Harold Crail had regained consciousness. He hadn't spoken yet, but his eyes had opened, his fingers had moved, and on his nightstand, guarded by a police officer, was a brown envelope labelled in Bernard Pendleton's familiar hand. Envelope 2. Its contents had not yet been read, but Miss Marple felt a shift in the air. The game, as she quietly told herself, was nearly at its end. Now it was time to set the final piece in motion. A light drizzle returned to Little Wimbrel the next morning, softening the village lanes and blurring the outlines of hedges and gables. It was the kind of rain that soaked through shawls and patience without ever turning to storm. The kind that discouraged hasty movement and encouraged reflection. But not everyone could afford the luxury of introspection now. The contents of Envelope 2 had not yet been made public, but word of its discovery had spread like fire through damp kindling. Every window curtain fluttered just a little more than usual that morning, and the post office was host to an unusual volume of errands from villagers with nothing to post. Even the Reverend Collingswood had received 3 unannounced callers by breakfast, each with vague concerns about upcoming services or inquiries about the history of the church treasury. Miss Marple, however, had not joined in the flurry. She remained in her parlour, writing a letter to her nephew Raymond and preparing a pot of strong Assam, but her eyes, though focused on the paper before her, held an alertness that spoke of deeper thoughts. She was waiting for a sign, for a tremor in the fabric of the village routine, and by mid-morning it came. Inspector Brantham knocked at her door shortly after 10, hat in hand, his expression torn between frustration and admiration. "He's speaking," the inspector said without preamble. "Harold Crail. He's weak, but his mind is clear, and he's confirmed something." Miss Marple set aside her pen and motioned to the armchair by the hearth. "Do sit down, I expect." "You'd one tea?" Brantham declined with a shake of the head. "There isn't time. He says someone came to his cottage the night before the attack, asked about the envelope, pressed him, threatened him. He didn't see their faces properly, but he heard a voice, a woman's voice." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Did he say who he suspected?" "He said it reminded him of someone, Sylvia's aunt, Miss Dora Howard." Miss Marple nodded, unsurprised. "A woman of considerable resolve and a rigid sense of control. The sort who considers reputation more important than truth," Brantham paced. "We'll need to bring her in, cautiously. She's respected, and this will send shock waves, may I suggest?" Miss Marple said gently, "That you leave it to me first." He paused. I believe Miss Dora is not one to respond well to direct accusation, but she just might respond to something else. And what would that be?" "A story," said Miss Marple, her voice calm, "one in which she might find herself reflected a little too closely." 2 hours later, Miss Marple walked slowly up the neat stone path of the Howard residence, a folded shawl over one arm and a tin of home-made shortbread in the other. Sylvia answered the door, her face pale, but composed. "Miss Marple," she said, "please come in. Aunt Dora's just taken her tea in the drawing-room." Miss Marple stepped inside and paused. "Would you mind terribly if I spoke to her alone?" Sylvia blinked. "Of course, if you think that's best." In the drawing-room, Miss Dora Howard sat ramrod straight in her usual chair, a cup of tea untouched on the table beside her. Her eyes met Miss Marple's with a coolness that did not quite hide curiosity. "Miss Marple," she said, "I dare say you've come with more than shortbread." Miss Marple smiled. "You've always been a clever woman, Dora. I believe in order," Miss Howard replied stiffly, "and in the proper handling of matters that don't concern outsiders." Miss Marple set down the tin and took the chair opposite. "Forgive me, then, for venturing into such delicate territory. But you see, I've been thinking about reputation, about how it can become a prison." "I beg your pardon." Miss Marple folded her hands. "There's a story, not unlike our present one, years ago, in a village not so very different from Little Wimble. A woman was wrongly accused of a terrible misdeed. Her family believed the worst. Her name was quietly blackened, though the law never touched her, and her daughter grew up in the shadow of disgrace." Miss Dora's fingers tightened around her skirt. "In time," Miss Marple continued, "someone who knew the truth tried to set things right. But the past is a dangerous thing to unearth, and those who built their lives around the lie feared what might happen if the truth came out." "I don't see what this has to do with me," Miss Dora said sharply. "Don't you?" Miss Marple's voice was soft, almost sad. "You protected Sylvia. You raised her when her mother could not. But protecting her does not mean shielding her from the truth or perpetuating an injustice she didn't need to know," Dora snapped. "It would have ruined everything. Do you think she would have walked through this village with her head high if she'd known her mother's shame?" "She would have walked taller knowing her mother was innocent," Miss Marple said, "and she would have known you didn't need to silence anyone to keep her safe." Miss Dora looked away. The room fell into a brittle silence. After a moment, she spoke. "He was going to expose everything. Bernard. He came to me and told me he had the letters, the receipt." Said he was planning to make it public, clear Eleanor's name, and you couldn't allow that. I begged him to wait, to speak to me, not the village. He refused. Said the truth, didn't care for reputations. Miss Marple gave her a long, quiet look, and so you took matters into your own hands. I didn't mean to hurt him, she said bitterly. I only meant to frighten Harold. I thought he had the second envelope, if I could find it. I could burn it, end the whole business, but he wouldn't. Give it to me and Bernard. Miss Dora's voice dropped to a whisper. I slipped something into his cordial, a sedative, nothing lethal. I only wanted to keep him from speaking at the party. I didn't know he had a heart condition. I didn't mean Miss Marple closed her eyes, but he died. And now Harold may yet live to tell what you did. Miss Dora stood suddenly, shoulders trembling. Do what you must. I'll not defend myself further. There may still be time, Miss Marple said quietly, rising, for the truth, for dignity. By the time she left the Howard house, Miss Dora had already begun writing a statement. Inspector Brantham arrived shortly after. No struggle, no denial. Just an old woman seated at her desk. Undoing a lifetime of silence, that night Miss Marple sat by her fire once more, the shawl across her knees, her hands at rest. Envelope 2 had been read. Its contents matched Bernard's warning. The original forged receipt, signed by a long-dead treasurer, exonerated Eleanor Howard entirely. Bernard Pendleton had found it buried in church records, overlooked for decades. He had planned to deliver it to Sylvia himself. One envelope had cleared a name, another had prompted a murder, and now there was only one left to be opened, envelope 3, still sealed. Still in police hands, Miss Marple sipped her tea and gazed into the flames. She already knew what it contained. It wasn't just a warning. It was a final test of conscience, of character, of how far someone would go to protect a lie. And someone had failed it. The rain had stopped by dawn, leaving behind a freshness that settled into the hedges and rooftops of Little Wimbrel. A stillness lingered. Like the village itself was holding its breath in anticipation. News of Miss Dora Howard's confession had already begun to seep through the cracks of every closed door and drawn curtain. The quiet respectability of Little Wimbrel had once more been shaken by the echo of a scandal long buried. At the police station, Inspector Brantham sat behind his desk. The famous envelope 3 now open before him. He had waited to unseal it until after Miss Dora's written confession had been signed. There had been no protest, no attempt to disguise or twist the truth. Her statement was clear, her motives precise, though the morality behind them far more tangled. Brantham had asked Miss Marple to join him for the reading of the final envelope. She now sat opposite him, her gloves resting on the desk beside her, her expression calm, her eyes as sharp as ever. He read aloud, voice steady. To be opened only upon my death. The letter began in Bernard Pendleton's crisp, elegant hand. If you are reading this, then my suspicions were correct. There is someone in Little Wimbrel who will go to great lengths perhaps, even fatal ones, to prevent the past from coming to light. I regret waiting this long to act, but fear and a misguided sense of mercy stayed my hand for years. I should have spoken when the truth was young. Now it is old and heavy, and its weight may yet crush those who tried to bury it. Brantham paused, then continued. There are 3 documents. 1, held by Edward Griggs, contains the outline of the scandal that led to Eleanor Howard's disgrace. 2, held by myself, is the original receipt that proves her innocence, which I discovered recently while reviewing archived church finances. And this, what I consider my legacy, is meant not for justice alone, but for judgment. Here Brantham looked up at Miss Marple, but she remained silent, her eyes lowered. In my final months I made a list, he went on, reading from the page, a list of every person who knew the truth, who suspected it, or who helped to suppress it, whether through silence, misdirection, or manipulation. I do not accuse them of malice, not all of them, but each bears a portion of the blame. Brantham turned the page, revealing the names. There were 6 in all: Miss Dora Howard, Reverend Collingswood, Edward Griggs, Harold Crail, Sylvia Howard, and Bernard Pendleton himself. Brantham folded the letter and set it gently on the desk. I didn't expect her name to be here, he said quietly, tapping the page. Sylvia. Miss Marple's voice was soft. Nor did she. Brantham leaned back in his chair. Do you believe she knew? I believe, Miss Marple said, that she suspected, and I believe Harold tried to warn her, perhaps too gently. Perhaps too late, but she was surrounded, Inspector, raised, by a woman whose obsession with control was matched only by her fear of shame. Sylvia learned to read between the lines from a very young age. She lied to you, to us all. She concealed, Miss Marple corrected, which is not quite the same. She believed Harold's hints were personal judgments, perhaps accusations of impropriety, not injustice. She didn't understand the full picture. But once she realized something more dangerous was hidden in that envelope, she became afraid, not of guilt, but of what it might change. Brantham was silent for a moment, then asked, "What will happen to her now?" "That depends," said Miss Marple, "on whether she continues to conceal, whether she's brave enough to tell the truth." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to Sylvia's home one final time. The air was thick with humidity, though no storm had yet arrived. Insects buzzed in the hedges, and somewhere a lark called out a long, wistful tune. Sylvia opened the door slowly. Her eyes were rimmed red, though her voice remained steady. "I thought you might come," she said, stepping aside. They sat together in the drawing room, where the air was close and smelled faintly of roses and old books. Sylvia did not offer tea. "Is she going to prison?" Sylvia asked quietly. Looking at the carpet, "Your aunt," Miss Marple responded gently. "That will be for the courts to decide. But she has confessed. The authorities will take her age, her intent, and her cooperation into account." Sylvia gave a nod that barely moved her head. "She did it for me." "No," Miss Marple said, with firm kindness. "She did it for herself, to protect an illusion she created about what was best for you." "I was afraid," Sylvia whispered. "I thought if people knew what my mother was accused of, they'd look at me differently. They might have." Miss Marple agreed. "People are quick to judge and slow to forget, but truth, once hidden, grows fangs. It demands attention, and it exacts a price." Sylvia looked away. "Did you know from the beginning?" Miss Marple's smile was faint. "I had suspicions, but one must never rush to judgment. Even when people lie, it is often not to deceive others, but to protect themselves." Sylvia stood abruptly and walked to the window. Rain had begun to fall. Again just a whisper against the glass. "I found the first letter Bernard sent to Aunt Dora," she said. "She had hidden it inside an old book of sermons. I read it yesterday. He wrote that he'd loved my mother once, that he hadn't stood up for her when it mattered. He said he regretted it every day." Miss Marple rose slowly, her voice low. "We all carry regrets, but few of us are brave enough to face them before it's too late." Sylvia turned from the window. "I want to make a statement to the inspector, to tell what I know, what I suspected. I should have said it sooner." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "That would be the honourable thing." As she left the house, the rain began to pick up, streaking the cobblestones and misting her spectacles, but there was something clean about it now, something necessary. It washed the village slowly, as if preparing it for the quiet that would follow. News of the case's conclusion spread more slowly than its beginning, and with less fervour. Miss Dora Howard was taken quietly to Melbury, where she awaited her hearing. Her confession had spared Sylvia further suspicion, but whispers would linger, as they always do in small places. Harold Crail, once suspected and nearly killed, chose not to return to the village after his recovery. He wrote a note to Sylvia, short but kind, and left the cottage keys with Miss Marple. And Bernard Pendleton, buried with a modest ceremony beside his daughter, had at last done what he could not in life, cleared Eleanor Howard's name for Miss Marple. There was no satisfaction in vindication, only the soft, steady awareness that justice thou imperfect had found its way through. She spent her evening quietly, tending to her roses and listening to the soft patter of rain against the eaves. The mystery of the envelopes was no longer a mystery, it was a reminder of the fragile weight of secrets, the lengths to which people will go to preserve a false peace, and the quiet strength it takes to tell the truth when telling it might break everything. But some things, Miss Marple thought as she reached for her teacup, must be broken before they can be rebuilt. There was still one final day to come. One more step before little Wimbrel could return to itself, and Miss Marple would be watching, as always, observing, understanding, waiting. 3 days later, the village of Little Wimbrel stirred under a soft, golden sun. The storm had passed, and in its wake, everything looked just a touch more vivid, the hedges more neatly trimmed, the cobbles freshly rinsed. The flowers along the green bursting with early summer colour. Life, it seemed, was returning to normal, or at least something that resembled it. At Gossington Hall, the rose beds had been carefully tended by the gardener, though the party lawn still bore a faint patch of yellow where Bernard Pendleton's body had been found. Mrs. Lavinia Blackwood had not hosted another gathering since that fateful day and was unlikely to do so for the remainder of the season. She had taken to wearing darker colours and speaking in lowered tones, as if in perpetual memorial for the scandal that had dared to visit her croquet lawn. But people talk less now. They moved slower, smiled more cautiously, and when they did, speak of it quietly, over tea or in the corner aisles of the greengrocer, it was with a kind of awe, as if they had glimpsed something sharp beneath the soft skin of their lives. Something that reminded them how thin the veneer of decency could be when stretched over human frailty. Miss Dora Howard remained in Melbury, confined not by bars, but by the quiet dignity of voluntary remand. Her statement, thorough and unambiguous, had reached the Crown Prosecutor by courier. The expectation was that she would receive a lenient sentence, if one at all due to her age, her confession, and her role as guardian, not aggressor. She had, after all, administered a sleeping draught, not a blade. Her only crime, some murmured, had been caring too deeply in the wrong direction. Harold Crail, released from hospital and absent from the village, had sent a letter to Miss Marple, thanking her for her quiet persistence. He had rented a room in a guest house near the sea and hoped, in time, to return to teaching. "It is strange," he wrote, "how I feel both freed and burdened by the truth. As if I've escaped something that was never mine to carry." Sylvia Howard remained in Little Wimbrel, though not without scars. The revelation about her mother's innocence had brought her a strange kind of solace. Even as it dismantled much of what she'd been told growing up, she had begun volunteering at the parish archive, carefully restoring old records with quiet diligence. When asked why, she simply said, "There are always stories we forget to tell properly." On the Saturday following the reading of the final envelope, a small gathering took place in the churchyard service, not for Bernard Pendleton's burial, which had already occurred, but a commemoration. It was Reverend Collingswood who had suggested it. Sometimes, he had said, a man deserves a second funeral, one that acknowledges the truth. The vicar spoke softly beneath the arching branches of the yew tree. A modest circle of villagers before him, among them were Sylvia, Miss Marple, Edward Griggs the solicitor, and Mrs. Finch, who had declared that she would never be absent from anything involving moral instruction in life. Said the Reverend, Bernard Pendleton was not always easy. He was stubborn, private, sharp-tongued, but in death he gave something greater than himself. He gave the truth. And for that, we remember him not just as a banker or a neighbour, but as a man who tried perhaps too late, but nonetheless sincerely to make things right, after the service. They filed quietly back to the lane. The air was heavy with the scent of cut grass and honeysuckle. A blackbird whistled from the church spire. Miss Marple remained behind for a moment longer, her gaze resting on the small, unassuming headstone. Beneath it lay the man who had carried guilt for too long, and who had finally chosen to unburden it. She murmured something too soft for anyone else to hear. Then she turned and walked slowly back to the village, her parasol tapping gently against the stone path. At home, she found the morning paper folded neatly beside her tea tray. The front page bore no mention of Little Wimbrel, nor of Bernard Pendleton, nor of the Howard family. In the wider world, such stories were small and unremarkable, but Miss Marple knew better. She sat by the window, tea in hand, and watched as the village boys chased a ball down the lane. The world spun forward, as it always did, but in its revolutions. It carried the shape of past truths. Later that day, Inspector Brantham arrived, not in his official capacity, but as a guest. He brought a jar of raspberry jam and a rather sheepish expression. "I thought you might like this," he said, setting the jar on her kitchen table. Miss Marple smiled. "How kind." "I do enjoy raspberries. And how is the village, Inspector? Quiet?" Brantham took the chair opposite her. "It is, for now." They sat for a while in comfortable silence. Then he said, "You knew all along, didn't you, about Miss Dora, about Sylvia, about the envelopes?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Not all, but I've learned that if one listens carefully, people tell you everything you need to know. They rarely mean to, but they do. I nearly arrested Harold," Brantham said, sighing. "I thought I had it all figured out. The argument, his distance, his evasiveness. Evasiveness is not guilt." Miss Marple said gently, "It's often painful, or shame, or the exhaustion of being misunderstood." Brantham chuckled softly. "You make it sound so simple." "Oh, human nature is never simple," she replied, "but it is consistent." They shared tea and cake, and then he rose to leave. At the door, he paused. "Will you be writing about this for your nephew?" "I expect I might," Miss Marple said, "though I doubt he'll believe half of it." Brantham smiled and tipped his hat. "Good day, Miss Marple," when he had gone. She returned to her chair and picked up her knitting. The needles clicked softly in the late afternoon light, a rhythm as familiar as the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. Outside, the village moved gently around her. A dog barked. A cart rattled over cobblestones. Someone called out across the green. All was as it should be. But Miss Marple knew that peace was not the absence of trouble. It was the result of truths laid bare, of secrets unearthed and faced. It was not always comfortable, nor always neat, but it was honest, and in Little Wimbrel, at least for now, that was enough. As the sun dipped below the hills and the shadows lengthened along the lane, she allowed herself a rare smile. Justice, she thought, had worn a quiet face this time, a face with a knitting needle in one hand, and a mind sharper than most would ever guess.